Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second S.R. Nathan Fellowship Young Leaders Seminar titled Giving Voice to a Silent Epidemic, Transforming Youth Mental Health in Singapore. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Rayner Tan, Assistant Professor at the Swee Hock School of Public Health, National University of Singapore. Following his keynote, Dr. Tan will be joined by Dr. Jacqueline Tilley, Assistant Professor at the National Institute of Education, NIE, and Mr. Daniel Ho, Senior Clinical Psychologist at the Institute of Mental Health, for a panel discussion. The subsequent Q&A session will be chaired by Ms. Alia Fatin Abdullah, Head of Digital Media and Analytics and Head of Digital Solutions at MUIS. Because of the sensitive and potentially triggering content that will be discussed today, there is a SAFE team made up of 3 volunteers from Dr. Rayner's research lab. If you need psychological first aid, please look for any of them wearing pink lanyard. Before we begin, please allow me to go over some housekeeping rules for the event. Thank you all for joining us at the auditorium today. Please be reminded to switch your mobile phones to silent mode. The lecture is being streamed live on Facebook. It will also be recorded and uploaded onto our IPS website and our social media platforms later. Please submit your comments and questions at any time during the lecture through the Facebook comments. For our audience members here at the auditorium today, please step up to the mic during the Q&A session to ask your questions. We would also like to hear your views on the event. There will be a link in the feed and QR code at the end of the lecture to submit your feedback. Director of IPS, Janadas Devan, will now deliver his opening remarks. Director, please.
Welcome, everyone. This is the second S.R. Nathan Fellowship Young Leaders Seminar. We launched the seminar series sometime earlier last year, and it's been encouraging to see the interest and conversations it has sparked. The Young Leaders Seminar series was conceived as a complement to the S.R. Nathan Fellowship series. I think we are on to our 16th or so S.R. Nathan Fellow now. While the fellowship series features generally senior people reflecting on Singapore's development, this series, this young leaders seminar series, provides a platform for younger Singaporeans to share their insights, research, and lived experiences on contemporary challenges. Today's seminar is titled, as you can see, Giving Voice to a Silent Epidemic, Transforming Youth Mental Health in Singapore. I am not an authority on this subject. I'm the last person you should ask about this subject. I'm 72 years old. In my generation, I don't think we had the word wellness. I myself think I heard the concept of work-life balance when I was well into my 50s. For my generation, you rested and exercised so that you could work better. So the concept I remember being surprised when work-life balance became an issue. Took me a while to understand what it was about, but the data is quite clear. The data tells a far more complex and sobering story. Recent data suggests that nearly 1 in 3 young people, youths in Singapore, report poor mental health. And there are rising rates of severe depression, and these are all clinical data, anxiety and suicide. And I'm sure that distress isn't born in a vacuum. It must be shaped by a number of modern epidemics, social media use, academic pressure, social isolation, and various other things. And if you are to bridge the gap between generation and more pertinently preserve the future, we have to look at the structural and social factors that will be discussed today. The keynote will be delivered by Dr. Rayner Tan, who is Assistant Professor at the Swee Hock School of Public Health at the NUS, and he will share his research on population mental health and set the stage by examining these pathways and their implications for youth mental health in Singapore. Following the keynote, there will be a panel discussion moderated by Ms. Alia Fatin Abdullah. She's the Head of Digital Media and Analytics and Head of Digital Solutions at Majlis Ugama Islam Singapura, that's MUIS. She'll be joined by Dr. Jacqueline Lee Tilley, she Assistant Professor at the National University Institute of Singapore, NIE, National Institute of Education. She was formerly, as it so happens, a fellow at IPS. And of course, Daniel Ho, Senior Clinical Psychologist at the Institute of Mental Health and Volunteer Clinical Coordinator at the Greenhouse Community Services. They will discuss how we can strengthen our response through a more holistic approach, one that balances clinical medicalisation with community support, peer involvement, and early intervention. I would like to thank our speakers for contributing their time and expertise, and all of you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Rayner Tan to begin his keynote address. Dr. Tan, please.
All right. Yeah, it never gets easier to give a presentation, but I just really want to thank Kay Jin for the lovely introduction, Prof. Devan for also opening and for the lovely introduction as well. Definitely to IPS for this real honor and privilege to be part of the Young Leaders series of the IPS SR Nathan Fellowship series. I want to also give a shout out to my own school, the Social School of Public Health. I think they've also supported me in not just my career development, but also seeing me as a human, as someone who it can develop in the area as well. So I just also want to thank my boss who is here, I think Prof. YY, who's here to support as well. I think one thing that I wanted to highlight, so can I get Lane, Denise, and Kuhan, like the one with the pink lanyards? I don't know if you saw them earlier, but yeah, say hi. Okay, so if, just as a content warning, I think through this presentation, I might just share a few things, both from my own lived experience, but also from the data that might be distressing. You can approach my colleagues there, who are all trained in psychological first aid to assist, and they'll help you out. Okay, let me just drink some water real quick. Okay, and I'm very grateful as well because I think this is one of the last few times that I can say that I'm a youth here. Hitting 40 soon, by most definitions, I'm not youth. But I'm just really happy that I can speak on this topic that's also close to my heart. And to do so, I just want to firstly maybe paint a picture of my own lived experiences as well, to share more about why this topic is important to me. So content warnings. All right. So recently, my sister sent me this photo of us. This was me in my childhood. But growing up, so I have ADHD, but I think it was pretty much undiagnosed throughout my early childhood, right? And I think you could see from my report cards over here that I was very unfocused. This is year after year. Every teacher would say that Rayner needs to learn to concentrate. Rayner needs to learn to concentrate. It's twice. Rayner has done fairly well, but he needs to be more serious in his work. I think these were some things that were constantly reported in my report cards. And actually at that time also, I was pulling out a lot of my hair. I think if one of the traits of ADHD, having that stimulation. So I actually have a lot of like bald spots on my face, and pretty much more. It was more stark early in my childhood. During that time, I did fairly okay. I mean, my parents, my mom completed secondary school, my dad completed junior college, so they were not very much pressuring me a lot on the academic front, for better or for worse. I think I qualified for GEP, but then we didn't take it up because the school was too far. I think these were some things that shaped my own upbringing, right? But I was posted to a neighborhood school, somewhere close to the primary school that I was at. I had my first taste of what privilege was at the time because my grandfather was on the board of St. Andrew's Cathedral, and he was also on the board of Anglican High School. And so I found my way into Anglican High School by pulling strings. But and I think these are some of the privileges that I've had in my own life. But I think it started to become more tumultuous for me in my secondary school days. During then, I was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, so I have always had motor and vocal tics, and I still have it now. And usually when I talk about it, I tic a bit more, but this is something that led to a lot of bullying back in school. I think this coupled with being overweight, coupled with things like me trying to figure out my own sexuality, things like me trying to figure out my own relationship with religion, things like that were pretty, I guess, a difficult time for me. I remember going home to cry, every night, feeling like the loneliest person in the world. It was also during a time when, I also experienced suicidal thoughts in my life. But that thankfully didn't amount to any actions on my part. And I think that void, I carried it with me till later years, right? So I graduated, I went to JC, I went to Victoria JC, I went to SMU, and actually, during that period of time, I also found drugs, and I became addicted to drugs. And I think fast forward, I'm not going to share too much detail, but along the way, I had to deal with things like HIV, things like sexual trauma, like violence, things that also shaped the ways that I saw myself as an individual. And I dropped out of SMU. I was in the business degree. I dropped out of SMU 2 years in, and then I went to rehab. And once more, a taste of privilege as well, right? So this rehab that I went to was a voluntary rehab overseas. So my parents were able to send me there, and I stayed there for 2 months in Thailand to recover, right? And I think at that point in time, actually, it was the first time I heard of this concept of mental health. I never knew that mental health existed, and I think I was also subject to a lot of mental health there because, we had group therapy twice a day. I had one-to-one therapy, 3 times a week. And, this was something that made me think a lot about mental health back then. And, when I left Thailand, I came back to Singapore, I really wanted to be a psychologist because I was so amazed at the work that my psychologist had done with me. And, when I came back to Singapore, I emailed the dean of the School of Social Sciences at SMU, with my entire story. He met me. He gave me a book called The Happiness Hypothesis, and I always remember that, and allowed me to readmit to the School of Social Sciences. Unfortunately, and I'm sorry to all psychologists in the room, I didn't end up doing psychology, but I ended up doing sociology instead. And I think one thing that I wanted to sort of reference, right, that really changed my way of thinking about mental health and well-being was that, I always thought a lot of the things that I was experiencing was a result of a mental or moral failing. That I was morally deficient, that as a person, I had evidence to show me that, these things were true, right? The bullying, things around me were telling me that I was that, right? That affected my self-concept. But, I started to see this link between personal troubles and public issues, which is something that, one of the sociologists that we learn about in Sociology 101 talks about, right? That oftentimes our personal troubles cannot be understood in a vacuum. They are the life of an individual, nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. And so, this is something that really made me see beyond this idea of being morally deficient or, like having personal failings, right? And this is what they call the sociological insight. And, I think I'm going to leave my story here because I think with the sociological insight, as we go through the data today, as we look through, the data on youth mental health in Singapore, I want us to also just remember that, every data point, is also an individual story that's also unique, that is also rich in terms of its own experiences. All right, so, in terms of the bigger picture, this is all stuff, I was just joking earlier that this is all stuff that you could possibly, Google, or, it's reported in the Straits Times. So I'll go, briefly through, the state of youth mental health in Singapore, and I believe my esteemed panelists will also go a little bit deeper into these areas too. When we think about youth mental health, I think one thing that I was drawn to, earlier on, that's not just based on youth mental health, was the Singapore mental health study, right? Based on Singaporeans. This was conducted back in 2016, and at that time, they found that about 1 in 8 respondents reported lifetime mood, anxiety, or alcohol use disorder. So this was something that was sort of very big, in terms of the data that we have for mental health in Singapore. How about from the same study, what are the contexts that kind of shape some of these things, right? And one very big data point that I often, reference and, I found it very alarming to me was this idea of adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences, this study found that 2 out of 3 Singaporeans reported at least one adverse childhood experience. And these are the different adverse childhood experiences that are reported in that study. In this representative sample of Singaporeans, almost half experienced emotional neglect, so on and so forth. I won't go into too much detail here, but you can start to see that these things shape how we experience health. And the literature actually tells us that experiencing adverse childhood experiences can predict a lot of later life mental health challenges as well. So this is where I think, I get really excited because we've got all our colleagues doing this great work on National Youth Mental Health Study, right? And this was also something that was picked up by the media and also shared quite broadly. And this is the figures that we tend to cite when we talk about youth mental health. That in this study conducted in 2022 among youth aged 15 to 35, about close to 1 in 3 youth reported experiencing severe or extremely severe symptoms of depression, anxiety, and/or stress. And when we look at the breakdown, it's characterized by a lot of people who experience symptoms of anxiety as well as symptoms of depression. There was also, I was looking for data, and this study also stood out, right? It's the YEAR study, Youth Epidemiology and Resilience Study. So this was a study based on school-based adolescents aged 18 to 11. So they had a measure that was self-reported by youth themselves or adolescents themselves. They also had a measure that was reported by parents on the child's behaviors. So I'll focus on the ones reported by the youth alone, right? And if we look at these DSM, DSM being the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for diagnosing mental health illnesses, this DSM-oriented scales show, the proportion of school-going adolescents who face these different types of issues. I think it's really stark that, about close to, I wouldn't say close to half, but 4 out of 10, youth face anxiety problems that are clinically significant. And I think also, with affective problems and such, these are things that we can't really ignore, right, in terms of our youth mental health. When we think about suicide in adolescents and youth, I think they offer us a different perspective in terms of youth mental health as well. So suicide is and still remains the leading cause of death for people aged 10 to 29 in Singapore. And I think every suicide is a tragedy, right? Actually, one thing that we think about also, and I think suicide is interesting, is because we always say that suicide is not always a mental health or mental illness issue. Because mental health disorders are not a necessary part of actually being suicidal. And I'll show you a little bit more of that later on. So now we talk about these broad data points in terms of what our youth are facing in terms of mental health challenges or mental disorders. What are then the factors that shape these contexts, right, that are important to know so that we can do something about it? I'm going to go into this very helpful infographic from the Straits Times, but I'll kind of walk you through it. So for this particular data set, these are the factors that are associated with symptoms of depression, anxiety, and/or stress. You can see over here that being of a younger age, because this was the data set of respondents aged 15 to 35, right? Actually, those closer to 15 reported higher levels of depression, anxiety, or stress compared to those who are older, or any of the mental health disorders. So you can start to think about, okay, what's happening during those years, right? That actually shape people's experiences of mental health. You can think about school, academic stress, and so on. These are some things that maybe you start thinking about. People who are single, people who, between 15 to 35 are single, you might start thinking about maybe the protective factors, right? Social support, having that kind of support from their family and so on. I think one thing that is also quite important to note is that there are certain social determinants here that speak to the context in which people face stressors or face pressures, right? These social determinants speak to maybe socioeconomic status, being unemployed, having lower educational attainment, being of lower socioeconomic status in terms of, let's say, their household income. You'll see that across these 3 measures of mental health, these are things that sort of are positively correlated with negative mental health outcomes as well. So you start to see and paint a picture of the context in which people are embedded in. This was a deeper dive. It was a study that was published based on the National Youth Mental Health Study in the Asian Journal of Psychiatry, which also kind of drove home the point, right? When you stratify by youth who are not in education, employment, or training, or NEET, you see that the prevalence of depression and anxiety is much higher. So National Youth Mental Health Study also looked beyond social determinants, right? I think it's also important to understand maybe what are some of the behavioral factors that shape youth mental health. And this is something that we saw being reported in the media, that excessive social media use, body shape concerns, cyberbullying, all these things that I think I resonate with. I think that kind of throw our own self-concept and self-identity in flux, right? Like identity diffusion. These things, like peer victimization, are things that are associated with poor mental health in our youth. Things like substance use, things like adverse childhood experiences, we already saw that in some data. I think this is where we start to see that, okay, there are certain behavioral or contextual factors beyond social determinants that shape youth mental health as well. The year study also found, and I think this corroborates with the previous slide, right, identity diffusion, which is basically a lack of integration of the concept of the self, with significant others, and what throws your identity in flux, things like bullying, things like, social comparison, social media, things like body image issues, and I think on the flip side, if you don't have someone telling you that you're okay, if you don't have someone telling you that, who you are is okay, that support, I think it also leaves things in flux as well, right? I think these are some risks as well as protective factors that we need to consider. In terms of stress, because the study also very helpfully stratified, stress at different levels, right? And we see in the study that those who are around 15 to 16 years old, from the comparison group was 11, but as you grow older, up to 16, you see stress peaking. Okay, this is not a class. I was going to ask, does anyone know what's happening at 16 years old? But I will tell you, because basically it's school stress, right? I remember taking my O-levels then, and this was a stressful time. I think it's a stressful time for many. During those years, it's a rush. And I think one thing that I found really interesting was that, with ethnicity, with race, this study actually did control for confounders, including socioeconomic status across school-going adolescents, but also still ethnicity, specifically race or being of Malay race, the adolescents were more likely to report a range of different clinical mental health issues compared to other adolescents of different race. The interesting nuance also is that you might think that maybe being more affluent would have more protective factors, but also in this study they found that housing type, the larger your housing type, the more likely you are to experience anxiety-related disorders during those years. So you can see that there are some nuances, right? And it's not just about social determinants directly, but it's about how these things shape our environment, shape our context, and shape the kind of pressures that we face. I think suicide is an interesting, I'm biased because I do suicide prevention research, but I think suicide also offers an interesting looking glass into the issues that you face as well, right? And this is a study that's based on an analysis of ED presentation in Singapore, and I want to also have a disclaimer here that those who present to the ED and are able to participate in this study have not been successful, right, in attempting or suicide. And we are not reflecting those who have died by suicide in this data. And you see that in terms of gender, those who present to the ED are more likely to be female. The method of suicide is also different. And I think studies around the world do see that men are more likely to use methods that are more likely to be lethal compared to women. And you can see over here that jumping from height definitely might, I wouldn't say definitely, but jumping from height is seen usually as something that's more lethal than drug overdose. And this study found that most of the participants or the respondents, were overdosing on paracetamol. And this study also helpfully pointed out different mental health kinds of contexts, which I won't go into further detail because these are covered already in the previous slides. But also, things that are social and behavioral. Past attempts of suicide, substance use, and also gender identity issues were some of the significant findings in this study. So, I want to talk about what the opportunities are, right? Now that we know a little bit more about the data, very broadly, now we know a little bit more about some hints of the context that people are in. So what are the opportunities here? So this a little bit more my story, right? So like, I think one thing that I found really interesting. So I just started to see a psychiatrist last year, to manage my ADHD. I think one thing that I went there, then I was like, yeah, I've been speaking about my journey with like addiction. I've been speaking my journey about HIV. I've been speaking about my journey about suicide. I go on these panels and all that. Like, do I really want another label? Like, I feel actually it was really like an imposter syndrome of mental health, right? I'm like, if I inhabit yet another label, am I really taking away someone else's true experiences? That was what was happening in my mind. But my psychiatrist said something that I found was really profound, and she told me that actually these labels are not very useful. But for sure, for someone like me as a psychiatrist, I think they are helpful in terms of maybe situating the care that I provide for you. But actually the question that I just want to ask you is, what kind of pain are you experiencing in your life? What kind of things are happening in your life right now that is causing you pain? And I think this really helped me change the way that I look at mental health, right? It's not just a collation of like labels and diagnoses, but it's about well-being as well, right? I think one thing that thankfully, other scholars have already been writing about this, right? And this idea of a dual continuum model of mental health, I think, explains quite a lot in terms of these experiences, lived experiences of mental health. So, I think the traditional model has been more of a pathogenic model, one that focuses on illness, right? That we are trying to pursue health based on the absence of illness, right? And I think this is a more medicalized model, which depends on things like diagnoses, medications, talk therapies, and so on. But I think one thing that scholars are also finding is that we also need to really think about health. WHO says it's a complete state, right? The definition of health, which I won't rehash here. But how do we then have a complete state? It's not just the absence of illness, but it's also the promotion of health and well-being. And the salutogenic model also promotes that. You can see these are continual, and actually, while they're interrelated, they're distinct. Because someone could have a high level of like maybe like living with mental illness, right? But also a high level of well-being, which I think I occupy that space, I think. But you can see that it's based on my own privileges, based on the resources that I have, and based on the things that I have access to today, including NUS insurance for mental well-being. But also one of the things is that on the flip side, you can have no mental illness, but also very poor levels of well-being. Right? And that's what we're seeing in suicide-related cases as well, right? The reason why we say that suicide is not often a mental health issue is because many people who attempt or die by suicide might be in situations that are situational, contextual, that leave them in despair or hopelessness, right? They might not have had previous mental health challenges reported. And this is helpful in helping us unpack some of the nuances of these things, and also, more importantly, helps us transform our thinking about what needs to be done. Right? That we're not just looking at the absence of illness, but we're trying to make sure that we do both equally at the same time in a very intentional, meaningful way. We don't have to start from scratch. I think the year study also shared the different areas of it measured resilience in our youth, right? And they found that resilience was also negatively correlated with some of these mental health challenges, and specifically some of these areas include positive self-image, having personal control, having emotional regulation. These are skills that we can potentially help build with our youth and young people. But I just want to also challenge this here, right? I think oftentimes we think of this as a one-size-fits-all model, right? But you can start to see, and the data is showing, at least from the studies that I presented earlier, studies that I'm doing on suicide prevention, is that the ways in which the risks that people face, the cultural logics of health, what matters to people, whether it's religion, whether it's like stigma, whether it's things like, that are important to them, right? Like certain forms of relationships are valued in some contexts over another. These are things that we need to attend to, and one-size-fits-all model tends not to work for these things. So, for example, this was Project Hire was a national suicide prevention strategy that we launched, in SG Mental Health Matters, which I'm a co-lead of. And this is a study of 60 interviewees. These vulnerable groups were identified by a working group that we established back in 2024 for the National Suicide Prevention Strategy. And I want to draw attention to neurodivergent youth, right? And I think talking to them and learning about their experiences of mental health care, that, right, we have pharmacological interventions, we have talk therapies, but actually these don't really serve us very well in terms of what we resonate with or what we value. The youth that we spoke to, talked about, let's say, art therapies, music therapies, right? Other forms of ways in which they can help promote their own mental well-being that is not traditionally based on, let's say, a more biomedical model. These are some things that we can consider, and we're working towards as tensions, right? When we have a more biomedical model at play. We also, as SG Mental Health Matters, we conducted a public consultation on National Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy. It was, and just for a recap, the National Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy has 4 focus areas, right? Expanding capacity, enhancing capabilities for early identification and intervention, also promoting mental health and well-being is in there, and improving workplace mental health and well-being too. And I think during that engagement session that we launched in late January, we got some feedback, initial feedback, some engagement from the audience on what they thought about the National Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy. And I think these are some of the responses, right? I think thematically and in the interest of time, I would say that I think people appreciated that there's a strategy. I think people appreciated that there's a focus on promoting mental health and well-being. But I think the key is really implementation and tailoring these things, these evidence-based practices for different communities out there. So, in context, I won't cover too much, but, there are some of these nuances that we have to attend to, right, when we're thinking about mental health interventions, whether it's family-based, like different generations within a family have different conceptions of mental health and well-being. How are you going to attend to those things? Even if we talk about workplace mental health and well-being, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but, there are different, it's intergenerational as well, with different people. How are we going to address that? We also are seeing changes in various epidemics, like Prof. Devan has mentioned. I think the issue of social media, screen time, these are some things that we grapple with, that youth today or adolescents today deal with a little bit of that in my time, but maybe not my parents' time. So there's something to deal with. Something that we also have to address are socioeconomic determinants of health, right? The people's access to health, the costs of mental health care and so on. And I think one thing that has come up in our research also is that we have to attend to different lived experiences of mental health and conceptions of mental health and well-being. So I'm going to end off soon. I'm just past my time. As a social scientist, as an implementation scientist, what is sustainable? What can we do? What is scalable? I think a simple way and scalable way is to also make sure that we include lived experience in our policy making and what we do, in service of our end users, right? In this sense, meaningfully engaging youth, adolescents, in terms of how we structure our mental health interventions and policies, because by engaging people with lived experience, you will know their needs well. You can think upstream. You can start to tailor interventions that are perhaps evidence-based practices elsewhere, towards certain communities here. I remember, I think I just had a conversation with Samaritans of Singapore late last year, right? And they were thinking, okay, we've got gatekeeper training for suicide prevention, but how do we then bring this to various communities out there? I think it needs to be tailored, right, based on the needs of different communities as well. I think by including lived experience, and this is something one of my colleagues, Dr. Chan, recently wrote about peer movements, we start to see that by lived experience will help us start linking personal troubles to public issues. Lived experience will also help us, I guess, not so much totally demedicalize, but also help us see from a more salutogenic point of view around what health and well-being means. And also, it's not just about practitioners and policymakers learning from patients and people with lived experience, but people with lived experience also start learning from policymakers and practitioners about some of the challenges, right, that health systems face around financing, around the distribution of care, and so on. And that kind of environment of participatory policymaking and health, I think, is something that can actually be sustainable and attends to some of these nuances that are needed. I won't go into too much detail here. This slide just says context is important when thinking about interventions. This is a focus of implementation science, that tries to address the no-do gap. And this is something that I can talk about another time in the interest of time. But you can also see over here that we have different lived experiences from different groups, and being able to tailor some of these things is important. Okay, this is my last slide. I think this is from one of the authors who wrote about this complete state model of health. Right? Mental health policy can no longer proclaim to promote the mental health of the population while investing only in treatment and the study of mental illness. Public health cannot promote mental health solely by reducing mental illness, and no amount of wishful thinking will make this fact disappear. So, as someone in public health, I think there is a certain urgency, right? As we try and structure our national mental health and well-being policy, one thing that we have there, and it's already a policy intention, is that we want to promote mental health and well-being. How we do it then, should not focus mainly on mental illness, but also think through what mental health and well-being means, especially to youth here in Singapore. And what better way to do that than by involving youth as part of that whole process. And these are all my lab members. Some of them are here. I want to just acknowledge their support and help throughout the years that I've been in my current lab. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tan. For those watching the lecture on Facebook, please submit your comments and questions through the Facebook comment box. For our audience members here, please step up to the mic to ask your questions. May I now invite Dr. Jacqueline Tilly, Assistant Professor at the National Institute of Education, and Mr. Daniel Ho, Senior Clinical Psychologist at the Institute of Mental Health, and Ms. Alia Fatin Abdullah, Head of Digital Media and Analytics and Head of Digital Solutions at MUIS, to start the panel discussion.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Alia Abdullah. I'm actually from MUIS, which is the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore. Before I start, actually, I wanted to thank Dr. Rayner for that beautiful presentation. I think I've learned so much in terms of some of the data and some of the lived experience, some of the insights that you've brought, and I think that it set the stage so nicely for all of us to have further conversations here today. Interestingly, just like Dr. Rayner, 2 years ago I was also diagnosed with ADHD, but I kind of knew it my whole life. I think similar to you, when I saw the school reports, I'm like, wow, this is like reading my own school reports. But later having been properly diagnosed and all that helped in terms of trying to make sense of life and all that. I'm also a caregiver to a family member who has OCD, depression, and anxiety. With one episode where I was actually visiting him daily in the hospital when he was hospitalized at IMH. So I think you would understand why this topic is something that is very close to my heart. I think same to all of you here. All of you being here online or in person must be something that really touches your heart, something that kind of inspired you to come here and listen to this conversation today. So without further ado, I will be handing the time over to Dr. Jacqueline, who will start with her presentation.
Hello. Thank you, IPS, as well as Rayner, for that powerful keynote. And thank you so much for clearly laying out both the scale as well as the urgency of mental health challenges in Singapore. I think what your keynote clearly outlined was some of the key risk factors that shaping youth mental health in Singapore. And indeed, I would say that the research consistently and repeatedly shows globally that factors such as poverty, lack of opportunity, trauma, and discrimination critically contribute to youth mental health problems. In the next few minutes, however, I want to focus on a group of youth who appear successful by every conventional metrics: high academic achievement, impressive extracurricular portfolios, leadership roles, strong future prospects, and yet emerging research indicates that they also show some of the highest rates of anxiety and depression among youth. So the question really is what's going on, right? What are we missing? So for decades, developmental research has largely assumed that attending a well-resourced school with academically engaged peers, highly involved parents, and clear pathways to future success would produce both positive academic as well as psychological outcomes. But over the past 2 decades, what we've seen is that this assumption has been increasingly challenged. In a series of studies beginning in the early 2000s, Sunil Luther, who was then at Columbia University, found that adolescents in high-achieving environments or high-achieving schools in the US were more likely to report higher levels of anxiety, depression, substance use, and delinquency compared to both national norms in the US, as well as youth from less well-resourced communities. Now, what she argued was that this mental health risk was actually driven by a confluence of unrelenting achievement pressures coming from the young person's environment. At the top, we have societal attitudes and culture, which emphasizes the belief that success is scarce, competition is global, and falling behind comes at a real cost. The pressure that gets transmitted through these pressures then get transmitted to the youth through their microsystems, right? And that would be something like their schools, where they have high academic demands, their parents, who have intense expectations of their children, as well as peers who, there are social comparisons, there's peer competition within the school environment. And this leads many youth to believe that they have to be excellent everywhere, all the time. Over time, what happens is that this doesn't just create stress, right? It increases one's risk for anxiety, depression, burnout, and a whole host of other mental health issues, especially because many of these pressures often erode the very things that typically protect young people from mental health problems. And that is the close relationships with their parents, their peers, as well as trusted adults in school. So when I talk about studying youth in high-achieving environments, I often hear the big question of, so what, right? Aren't these just champagne problems? Well, the reason why I care is really threefold. First, research shows that these youth are at elevated risk for anxiety and depression. So if we care about youth mental health, then why wouldn't we care about them? Second, when these problems go untreated, they don't magically resolve themselves after exams or after graduation, right? They often become long-term mental health problems and coping difficulties that persist into adulthood and that also get in the way or impact future productivity. And third, and this is probably the most insidious part, their distress is often minimized because of their success. They look fine, they perform well. So their suffering gets dismissed by adults, by the mental health system, even by young people themselves. In addition, they don't really seek help, and this is because of stigma and the fear of failure, right? That makes them feel like showing that they're struggling may somehow be something that they can't afford in this very competitive environment. So far, I've been drawing mainly on research and theory that's originated in the US. But now I just want to pivot very briefly to Singapore and how young people in Singapore actually experience achievement pressures. To explore this, my research team and I interviewed over 40 students from IHLs in Singapore, or Institutes of Higher Learning in Singapore, and what they share sort of helps us understand what achievement pressures are outside of that abstract concept, and rather as an everyday lived experience. So one of the clearest themes from our interviews was this, that in Singapore, achievement isn't just a personal ambition of a youth, right? It's really a social norm. Students didn't describe doing well as a choice or a choice necessarily. They described it as a baseline, the minimum needed to be seen as capable or on track. As one student put it, since young, we're kind of taught that you need to work hard, that you need to do well in order to get somewhere in life. Another one likened the pressure to achieve like chronic pain. It's just always there. Now, the second part, which they also talked about, was that doing well was often not enough. Many described the second layer of pressure, and that is the need to stand out. And they needed to stand out in order to feel very secure, right? Because when everyone else around you is high achieving, then success becomes very relative. As one person put it, it's not enough to live a low-lying, humble life. We need to do something extraordinary to make sure we don't fall behind. Another student said that we're constantly feeling like we need to outdo someone else and do better. Together, these dynamics kind of explain to us why achievement pressures often feel so inescapable for these youth, and why many kids keep pushing even when they're exhausted. What our interviews also showed was that achievement pressure isn't just coming from one place. Okay? It's multi-layered and often self-reinforcing. On the first level, which is a structural level, you have many youth perceiving that their intense education system, as well as the system beyond education, creates rigid high-stakes pathways that leave very little room for exploration, detours, or flexibility in their pursuits. And then there's the relational layer. Family expectations, peer competition, these contribute significantly to stress while making success feel more like a necessity, an everyday necessity, rather than a choice. And when that becomes the environment that you grow up in for long enough, the problem is that the pressure doesn't just stay external. It becomes internalized. So even when no one is telling you to do well anymore, you still feel this need to do so. As one student put it, even though no one's telling you have to do well on tests, you just know, yeah? The problem, of course, is when students begin to use this achievement and sense of productivity as a way of measuring their own self-worth. That pressure doesn't simply disappear when they leave their family or their schools or their school system. It becomes an internalized, sort of an internalized lens through which that follows them through their life. Moreover, this internalized lens is sort of self-sustaining in its own right, because it gets reinforced by the very rewards that it produces. So many students didn't just say achievement pressure was bad. No, a lot of them talked about the real tangible benefits of achievement pressures. It provided them motivation, productivity, a sense of progress towards goals that they thought they wanted. The problem was that they also said this, that there were perceived costs, right? It often led to less rest, less self-care, sometimes strained relationships, sometimes even poorer mental health. So when students say things like, the stress pushes me to progress into a better version of myself, or it's stress that actually pushes me to do things, it also is talking about how they feel useless when they're not being productive. And what that shows us is that what they're really describing is how this has become a trade-off, right? Achievement pressures has become normalized or the cost of achievement pressures has become normalized for the goods that you can get out of it. And while success is sort of understood as a cost, and that cost is essentially treated as unavoidable, and in some cases, in many cases, worthwhile. So where does that leave us? Taken together, these findings point to a need for us to re-examine what it means to do well when we say someone is doing well. Because high performance can absolutely coexist with significant distress. But ultimately, achievement without well-being is not really success. In the long term, it would even be a barrier to productivity and to living well. What this means is that effective prevention is more than just figuring out better ways to help respond to these mental health symptoms that these youth feel, but rather requires a redefinition of success that includes psychological health, not just grades, credentials, or outcomes. Importantly, while it may seem tempting to blame one specific factor, whether that be parents or schools or policies or individual resilience, for contributing to these issues, the reality is that achievement pressures is produced by an interconnected network of factors, right, which that are tied together by these shared norms. So it's not just one domain alone. This means that the solution really lies with all of us as a society, because if this pressure is socially produced, then well-being also has to be socially protected. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jacqueline. Now I'll hand the time over to Mr. Daniel Ho, and after his presentation, we will proceed for the Q&A, where you can ask some of the questions by coming up to the mic.
Thank you. So firstly, I want to just start off by just expressing my gratitude for being able to be speaking about youth mental health. And I really liked your presentation, Jacqueline. Okay, so I think during this about 10 minutes or so that I have, I want to be speaking a little bit more about trauma, vulnerability, stigma, and marginalization. And I think so far what Rayner and Jacqueline have really brought up is a lot of data. Right? We see a lot of data about how psychological distress is significant among youth. So I just want to use this time to kind of step back and speak from a practice-based lens. And the reason why I think it's important, I think we'll follow in a bit. And I'll show you why. I want to start off with a little bit about myself. And to talk about that, I want to talk about positionality, which is how we see and from where do we see. So I work as a clinical psychologist in the Institute of Mental Health. There, I also do a lot of work in terms of trauma-informed care and response. And basically, there's a lot of ground-up work in terms of participation and just thinking together about how we can contribute to organizational change from a trauma-informed care perspective. The work that I do is in the child forensic team. So basically, what I work with a lot of youth who either have suffered significant traumatic events or youth at risk. And specifically, a lot of these youth that I work with experience this idea that society has failed them. They have been cast aside, and they feel like nobody understands them. Before that, I was working in REACH, which is a community mental health team. So that basically means that we go down to the schools, we communicate with the community agencies and the parents, and try to really understand what's going on at the community level. Outside of work, I volunteer with community-based organizations supporting marginalized and vulnerable communities. So this is either like socioeconomic status, folks who use substances, people who are LGBTQ+. And then aside from that, I also volunteer supporting peer support and community-based helpers in Southeast Asia, so specifically Thailand and Myanmar. And because of that, my interest in trauma, relation work, and marginalization. So when I look at all of this, I realize that all of this work kind of allows me to see that sometimes it's not helpful to just look at it from our perspective, right? Because a lot of times you're existing in communities that you may not understand at all how it is like. And it's more important to look from that perspective. And of course, beyond that, before that I was a musician, so I worked for a decade as a music educator. So a lot of my musician friends would tell me that they didn't take the traditional academic path, right? So they often felt like they were not pragmatic, for example, in that sense. And I could not disagree more, right? They are wonderful, beautiful people. I spent some time in airport cargo services. Aside from that, I also was a son, a brother, and a friend. And I think all of you have these identities, and all of you have the ability to look from various perspectives. And with that, I think I want to center this entire presentation, the remaining 7 minutes or so, to really speak from the perspective and center the perspective of my client, my patients, and the caregivers that I work with. Okay, technically also a youth, because MCCY says it's 15 to 35, so I'm still a youth. So I want to start off with this line here. they won't listen one, there's no point. Right? You probably have heard that said before, and maybe when you were young, you might have also said that before. And I think, I just want to wonder a little bit about even this title, right? Giving voice to a silent epidemic. Is it really silent? Or is it because when we look at the situation, it's silent from where we are looking at, but maybe they're shouting quite loudly. We're just not hearing it from where we are. And for us to be able to really listen what's happening, we need to go to be with them, right? To understand where it's coming from. And I think sometimes data can obscure that. And perhaps let's take some moment to really think from where they are, right? So I just start with, I think the best way to frame it is, I'm going to list some of the 3 questions that really come up, right? Either in my sessions or in conversations with people around me. So the first question that often comes up, back in my time, how come, right? Translation, things weren't like this in the past. Right? It's true, things weren't like this in the past. Maybe they were, maybe they're not. Right? And the reality is, yes, times have changed. Right? Things are very, very different now. It is indeed true. Yes, for example, we live in a hyper-connected world now. Our youth today are digital natives. Right? To them, the idea of not using their phones, unthinkable. The idea of not being able to communicate with my friends after school, perhaps maybe to discuss the latest trends, or even to actually discuss homework. And parents don't really believe that the youth will discuss homework on phones, but it is true, they do. But they do that, right? So the thing is that they are in completely different worlds, so why do we expect things to be the same? Of course times have changed. Right? So what works in the past may not work today, and we need to look at it from that perspective. Another question, because of where I'm working now, like that also trauma. Everything also trauma. Translation, everything counts as trauma these days. And to that, well, yes, right? Hypothetically speaking, concept creep can be an issue. We do know that sometimes when a concept comes up, increasingly over time, people use more and more phenomena and explain that as this particular concept. Right? But I do want to say that at the same time, we need to recognize that language is evolving. Right? There is increasingly more terms coming up today to help us recognize our challenges, our problems. I think only recently there was a term called quiet quitting, right? And I never knew what that meant. You know, and I had to Google and then read up, and I was like, okay, so that's what it meant, right? And the reality is that language reflects the lenses through which we see, we learn, and we experience. The same term today is going to mean different things tomorrow. And case in point, I was just writing this just now, and this morning I was attending a workshop, right? And one of the facilitators, Dr. Chris McCurry, he gave a really beautiful metaphor. Could you see what's on my clipboard over here? Okay, so some of you say like 13, okay? And I guess that makes sense, because if I put 12 beside it and 14 beside it, it is indeed 13, right? But what if I put A and C above and below it, and then suddenly this looks like B? Right, so depending on whether you see it as B or 13, depends on the context. Right? And because of that, language evolves as well. Something that makes sense in the past might not make similar sense today. So being able to hold that nuance becomes important. Being able to balance between popular language and clinical language is important. Right? So essentially, popular language helps people, right, get them through the door, and then clinical language helps us to use clinical care responsibly as well. So I think we need to recognize, right, that yes, sometimes when we hear that you say that, you know, this is like, oh, I'm really, really, like, I want a KMS. Does anyone know what KMS means? Yeah? Right. And KMS means kill myself. Right? And we want to be like, you know, why are you saying something like that? It's terrible. But maybe that's what they use to represent their experiences, and maybe we should listen and see from their perspective. Right? I think at the same time, I do want to comment, right, that trauma is real. Right? We also know that trauma interacts with what we call the biopsychosocial model, bio as in biological determinants, Psychological could be things like personality traits, coping styles, and also the social model, right? How trauma interacts with your immediate environment, and that have significant impacts on how it's presented and expressed. So knowing social context matters as well, right? And I want to bring that to marginalized and vulnerable communities. Now, if you think about these communities, a lot of times we don't really realize what these experiences are like. And because perhaps there is a minority, we haven't actually experienced what it's like. So perhaps they have unique contexts that we need to think about, that we may never fully understand, but that doesn't mean we don't try. Because the same event experienced by different communities could have completely different impacts. And the sooner we recognize that, the more we are able to do something about it. And the final question, can we do more? And sometimes it's like, why is the wait time so long for public health care? You know? Translated, like that, how? What can we do? Look, the reality is that we operate on I believe, right, a whole of society approach, right? Not only there is a tiered care model of healthcare, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, we need to think about mental health in the context of society. What can all of us do beyond public healthcare institutions? And we can do a lot more as a society. So increasingly, I think in the earlier presentations, we saw a lot about peer supporters, engaging in peers with lived experiences. Right? Sometimes you might feel that alone, maybe I don't have training, I don't know what to do. But you know what? You are associated with a whole community of people, right? You have influence, you have your own power. Every small change that you do has an impact on the people around you, right? So perhaps, and I think this is my last slide. So one thing that we can perhaps do is let's start listening to them. Right, from where they are. Right? Sometimes it's hard, but we all have the experience of being in different places, situated in different identities, and certainly we can try to listen to them from where they are to see how things are like. And maybe you realize there are many things that are far more in common, and perhaps this idea of an ivory tower may not exist. Maybe they exist far above us, and we need to rise up to their level. And be curious. Find out more and be discerning too. So with that, thank you, and I'll hand the time back to Ruth.
Thank you so much, Mr. Daniel. Now we are going to an exciting part of the program, which is the Q&A segment. I think a lot of you will be looking forward to this. We actually have two ways for people to ask questions. One is coming up to the mics that you can see around the aisles. Second, actually the people who are joining us online on Facebook Live, so they can actually comment their questions, and the awesome IPS team is actually channeling those questions to me, so I will sometimes combine some of these questions and answer them. But before we start, I thought that I wanted to just emphasize certain ground rules. Number one, about us being here today, let's keep this space safe, respectful. We're all learning from each other, and we're all caring about this topic of youth mental health. Let's keep this a nice space to operate in. Number two, I think this is something that Dr. Rayner mentioned before his keynote, which is that we have that safety team. So at any point in these conversations that we're going to have after this, if you feel the need to step out or you need to get help, please feel free to do so. Okay, I see that we already have a gentleman up at the mic. Would you like to introduce yourself? Are you from any organization? And then ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you to the panelists for insightful sharings. My name is Jeremy. I'm a final year student in SIT studying electrical power engineering. And I have a question regarding mental wellness. I read a book once. It's called The Art of Intimacy. It's how individuals like ourselves can cultivate better relationships. And within the individual, that consists of three personas: the I, the personality, the me, the character, and the self, the spiritual essence of the individual. So within the book itself, it mentions that too much emphasis on the I or the personality leads to neuroticism. Too much emphasis on the character, the me, leads to psychosis, which can be attributed to crazy behaviors. And the spiritual side, the spiritual self, which is more towards how you can balance between these two personality types, between the personality and the character-wise. So within the book, it keeps mentioning this phrase again and again, being in the world in good faith. I'm still trying to understand and decipher that. Maybe perhaps you might be able to share more on how we can better use these techniques for our own individual mental wellness.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? And maybe you combine some of the questions before we get to that. Maybe one more, yeah?
I am too short, I'm sorry. Well, I was just wondering, okay, so we spoke a little bit about like the psychosocial factors and not just like the personal factors, right? And you know, my understanding of the title, The Silent Epidemic, is about how a lot of people with mental health and mental illness are afraid to talk about their mental health and mental illness. But, you know, I do a lot of nonprofit, a lot of on-the-ground kind of work, and what we're seeing is a really significant rise in youth homelessness. A lot of feedback from these youth who have become homeless that the guardrails that we have in place, whether it be, you know, the IMH guardrails or mediators, the victims are being pushed into conformity. So to just kind of tahan until 21 years old with their parents or with bullies in school. Or even like people who, like students who are like, for example, extremely interested in history. They want to know more, like the question about evaluate the causes of the Cold War, and then they're immediately like, oh, the just war theory, oh, like, you know, all this, like they're super enthusiastic, and then they're told, can you just conform to the curriculum and calm down and follow the curriculum, right? So, you know, I was just wondering, is there merit in shifting the conversation from what the individual can do to what parents or schools or really even MOE should do in order to, you know, like support these kids and these students who, in all fairness, like, do you really want to tell a kid, a teenager, to just tahan their abusive parent until they're 21? I wouldn't, because my mother has schizoid. And I was told that, and I don't think that is right. You know, we found out very late on, and I wish that she could have gotten treatment. But that didn't happen for me, and I hope that, you know, we are able to do something about this so that we don't continue having this rise of youth homelessness. We don't want our kids on the street, or at least I don't. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that question. Actually, it's related to a question that we just received online, which is the question comes from Pauline Lee, who asks, how can educators be better supported and informed in terms of youth mental health? So basically, how can educators, or like you mentioned, adults or caregivers and all that, support youth in mental health in different situations without, for this particular question was about without adding additional stress to the already heavy workload. But I think is that question on how is it in schools or in these environments that we have to have that conscious effort to support the students. I think that could be a question that I would direct to Dr. Jacqueline. For the first question that we had, it was on the three parts of mental health, right? So it's the I, and then which is the self, the character, and also the last one was about spiritual. Perhaps later we will also ask that to the panelists to see whether, you know, in your course of work or in the research that you do you come across any data that actually speaks to this? I'll hand over to Dr. Jacqueline first.
I think the question, if I'm not wrong, is about how educators can better support youth mental health without additional stress on themselves as well. I think that's always the hard part that we have to balance. Okay, without sounding like, you know, I'm advertising for NIE. Well, NIE technically has a lot of training programs for educators. We have the Basic Counseling for Teachers program, where teachers learn how basic counseling. In fact, now PTGE students or teachers to be have this basic counseling training as well, right? So we're already doing a lot, I think, if you want to talk about it, nationwide in terms of trying to up the skills of teachers without necessarily giving them so-called more work by integrating it within the work that they're already doing as part of the diploma, for example. But then you also have, just general PD stuff for teachers, which is like the certificate of school counseling. And then later on, some teachers go on to do the diploma in school counseling, become school counselors, right? And so there are a lot of programs out there, I think, that exist for professional development. They also have, I think, a lot of mini kind of courses online that MOE actually creates for teachers to up their skills in this area. So I think those things do exist, right? So I'm not really sure whether I've answered the question correctly. I think to a large extent, and that's what I tell almost all my students, it's really not always about skill set. Sometimes it's just being present and being intentional and having good faith in wanting to help your students, and that often is more than enough over and beyond all these skills that we can teach teachers and so on. But I do think that, if you really want to be to learn more about this stuff, it is out there, both formally as well as informally. If you tell your principal that this is something that educators might want as a brown bag lunch, right? Discussion during lunchtime, maybe that might be something that is worth doing, and I'd be happy to help out.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, I'm just going to weigh on the first one. I mean, the first question about being in the world in good faith. I didn't read the book you're talking about, but I think kind of like resonated with me in some ways. I think the ideas of multiple selves and I think just reminds me a lot of maybe the work that I'm doing therapeutically for myself, right? Like today, and like even today, I cannot say that I know myself, because part of being in the world is also that time and space changes the demands of what the world needs from you, right? And being in good faith, I think, at least for me, is recognizing that there are multiple selves, psychologically and clinically. Maybe these selves are some things that are hardwired. Some traumas have shaped the ways that you have react to things. Maybe these are some things that are based on your principles, maybe based on things that you've clarified for yourself over time. I think what that to me feels like, if you translate it over to something more mental health and mental illness, focus, right, is then thinking about, as someone living in this world, am I empowered to think through and have resources to, think through what I can do to better understand my own self, better understand my own needs today. Like I feel like, making sure that we have a system that allows people access to these kinds of services and these kinds of professional therapeutic services as well, to understand yourself as you move through this world, kind of makes sense to me in that sense. So I'm not so sure about the book, but this kind of spoke to me.
Yeah, I just want to also add on to that point and also address the other question about youth homelessness and conformity. I'm also not familiar with that book as well, but I think from what you speak of, what is happening over there sounds like it argues for a balance, right? It sounds like when you lean into any of the facets, that can result in challenges. And it kind of aligns quite nicely with the presentation actually, which is that a lot of times we have to balance between data, what is being presented, and also understanding what the voices are saying on the ground, right? And achieving that balance is not easy. In fact, there are a lot of inherent tensions between, it sounds like there are a lot of inherent tensions between all three angles as well. And linking that point to what we talked about in terms of the youth homelessness, right, the idea of conformity. I think the challenge here is a lot that often when there's tension, depending on where power lies, there is a tendency for blame to shift. For example, I think for the person who gives the example of, the parent who is living with challenges, it must really be quite difficult to live in that situation and for somebody to say, just tahan. Right? It almost feels like then the burden is placed upon you to deal with it, right? And I think sometimes that feels really, really unfair. And I think this is where the conversation we need to have is that when we negotiate this tension, how can we do so in a way that does not allow power to dictate who takes the blame, who takes the expectation, but in a way that perhaps maybe balances out a bit. And maybe I'm biased, but I do tend to think that the side that has a little bit more power needs to take a bit more action. But tell me what you think.
Thank you so much. Maybe I wanted to ask a bit, adding on to what you said, right, about this just tahan thing, right? What has been coming out a lot, because I do media monitoring in my work because of digital media, right? A lot of TikToks that are being posted about youth mental health and all that. They talk about, like, sometimes there are certain languages you should use and you shouldn't use. So something that I kind of like saw recently is about how, last time when people share their troubles or struggles with you in terms of mental health, people will say, yeah, me too, because they want to show that they kind of understand where you're coming from, and then they kind of like join in and also share a similar struggle. But what I saw in these TikToks is that some people say that it's invalidating. When you say me too, and then you start telling your story, it's like, oh, now you're shifting the attention to yourself. So I guess sometimes on an individual basis, or like, when you're trying to sort of like help everyone in terms of creating a healthy space in terms of mental health, I was wondering whether you have any tips in terms of that, like in terms of the language that you use, in terms of like meeting people where they are. I think that is a common thread that I see in the three presentations, right? It's really about seeing the person in front of you and meeting them where they are. Are there any insights that you would like to share on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just watching a YouTube clip last night. I love Brené Brown. Do you know Brené Brown? And I think Brené Brown says, disclosure without boundaries is not vulnerability. Because I think vulnerability takes courage. And, having to disclose things, as, maybe many of us do, right, in our daily lives. I think, like you can have someone who, like, outwardly cries all the time, just, like maybe it's your boss, like to show emotion, but, without boundaries, it can be invalidating. It can also, like, I guess undermine what we're trying to do with like mental well-being. But I think being able to understand where the disclosure comes from, I think is important in terms of, like promoting a culture of like courage, and vulnerability, right? Like vulnerability is not disclosure.
Oh, that's deep. I will read that. That will be in my next video tonight, doing by doom scrolling. Okay, we'll go on to, I think the gentleman over there has been waiting patiently from just now. Can we have your question, please?
Yeah, I'm Paul Tambaya from the medical school. And my question actually kind of follows on to the earlier questions, and it's about structural issues. Because when Rayner shared the chart from the year study, there's very clearly a spike at age 12 and at age 16. And every Singaporean knows what happens at age 12. And again, I'd like to advertise for the medical school here. And several years ago, we came up with a grade-free first year. And they were very, people thought, oh, it's terrible, people are not going to be motivated to study, all our surgeons will not know their anatomy. But that turned out not to be untrue. And in fact, it was so successful that now we have a grade-free first year and second year, and the whole of NUS has grown grade-free for the first year, as far as I know, although I think some departments don't enforce that. But I'm just wondering whether we could do something structurally, because as far as I know, we're the only high-income country which subjects 12-year-olds to a standardized test which forces their parents to take 6 months of leave to coach them for this test. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jacqueline, I don't know, I thought of you because it's academics.
I'm not exactly, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on this area, but I do think one thing that we should think about is not, it's very easy to just say it's the exam, right? That's causing this, or the exams are causing this. But I mean, even when you talk about it, you don't talk about the fact that the exams are happening. You talk about the fact that the parents are taking 6 months of leave. And the question becomes, why are the parents taking out 6 months of leave? It's not, like, it could be anything, right? It doesn't have to be the exam. If you took away the exam, the parents could be doing something else instead that would increase the stress of their kids at that particular point, at any particular point, right? So I think that it really is much more of a societal issue than just saying, oh, at 12 and 16 we have these exams which, you know, are high stakes necessarily. I think it's a bigger question about what meaning we place as a society on these exams. The exams in and of itself can be, you know, if we see it as a learning tool, let's try to figure out, you know, where the kids are at so that, you know, it's a learning tool, rather than thinking about it as a society that is more than that, right? That it determines an entire life trajectory, for example. I think that then reduces the amount of stress and reduces the amount of stakes that we somehow are placing on this. I think the question really becomes, as a society, why have we created these exams to be such a huge thing, right? What do you think is causing that? And I think that's a broader question than, you know, what initially may seem like, you know, a very simple solution.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacqueline. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in terms of the meaning that you place in these like examinations, and it comes from everywhere. I think a couple of months ago they had the PSLE results, and now, you know, a lot of parents want to be content creators as well. So they're on TikTok live streaming their kids getting results, and I saw parents who were like, when their kids got their results, they burst into tears because it felt like their exams as well. And that made me really, I'm a mom of 4 young kids. That made me really stop and think like, wow, when it comes to my kids, right, how am I going to really handle this? You know, because like, you know, in theory, sometimes it sounds okay, like, you know, you don't put pressure, don't put stress and all that, but sometimes you worry for your kids as well. So there is that balance, but then, yeah, the immense amount of pressure and the meaning that you put into those exams is substantial, definitely, in terms of how we look at exams as Singaporeans. Okay, I'll go to one question online before I go on to the questions from the people who are queuing up patiently at the mic now. Okay, there is a question specifically for Dr. Rayner. This question comes from Geraldine Kang, who's joining us online. I wonder if Dr. Rayner can share more thoughts about reducing the medicalisation of mental health conditions. Is he referring to the context of public health care? And how can this become a concrete reality? What shift do you think needs to happen?
Thank you. I mean, I think, at least to me, you know, as someone who does qualitative research, I actually have to go teach at 6 o'clock qualitative research as these students here. But, you know, when you do qualitative research, you speak to people, you know, you start to see some tensions, right, in terms of people's lived experiences against, you know, things like diagnoses. You know, diagnosis is also a reflection of access and power, right? Because who gets to diagnose? What are the opportunities to get diagnosed? You know, that opens you up to access, right? So, you know, these kinds of things like shape how we structure like a tiered care model, for example. But, you know, sometimes they're not aligned with how people experience health and well-being. I think I won't go into too much detail, you know, like some of the ways that we measure these things, you know, like assume a illness paradigm, right? But, you know, when we think about well-being and health, you know, different people conceptualize it differently. For me, because there's so much variation in, you know, different communities and different contexts that we need to attend to, the best way is to, you know, like, I think it addresses the earlier comment, you know, like, you know, do we just rely on educators? You know, like, I think we need to really empower communities, do task shifting, you know, trust that, you know, people will do good, you know, for their own communities. So that they can contextualize care and elevate lived experiences. You know, so, you know, being able to have a whole society of people who can care, are trained, but also can tailor these things based on the lived experiences of their own selves, right, and their own communities. I think it's a more sustainable model that, I guess, I wouldn't say it decenters medicalization, but also it helps to create some tension there. You know, and I think it's not that medicalization is a bad thing. You know, like we've run on it to produce efficiency. You know, it's something that is worthwhile. But then I think
if we are fixated on that as the main model of what is success in mental health, I think it could be problematic.
Thank you so much. Does anyone want to weigh in, Dr. Den? No? Okay, then we'll move on to the next question from the gentleman at the mic. Could you introduce yourself and whether there are any organizations you're representing today?
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. So I'm Nizant. I'm a year 1 university undergrad at SUSS. I'm doing accountancy. So actually, although I'm doing a business degree, I am interested in like mental health as a social cause because I personally have been bullied a lot ever since my childhood. I mean, in national service, I wasn't able to be in a combat role too because of a particular medical condition. And that led to a lot more bullying too. Personally, I'm someone who does not like the idea of like toxic masculinity, you know, to like man up and you like go ahead with whatever comes in your life. So for the past 2 years, I've been going for like youth engagements to understand the mental health landscape better. Actually, I saw Dr. Rayner last year at the NUS Social Policy Forum. So good to see you again. Actually, I was at a regional peace building program 2 weeks ago, and 2 of the modules which were covered was about mental health resilience and psychological first aid, which was, it doesn't seem very correlated to peace building when you think of it directly, but retrospectively, when you think about it, it's very important that people in society have to be happy with their state of mental health first before they proceed ahead with talks about progress and development, you know. And seeing the presentations today, I think it just reinforces the fact that if we don't solve the foundational stigmas and stereotypes surrounding mental health, there's not a lot of progress which can happen. And I agree with Dr. Daniel's your argument about, you know, the people with more power, they should try to take more accountability, something of a line that I was hearing also in the program. But what I felt was important is that everyone is supposed to take some part of accountability. Shared accountability is the concept, because we can't just push a blame on anyone for any of this which is happening. It's both systemic, the government is a stakeholder, but it's also societal. I believe all of us have a part in it. So why do you believe, in the 3 of your perspectives, is it so difficult to make small changes happen? Because I think when you want to step in a person's life, we tend to put our advice, our personal perspective, a lot of weightage on that versus their own perspective, you know. It goes very simply from someone having a breakup. You know, we go and say, yeah, that guy was never meant for you, no, that girl was never meant for you, to bigger decisions, you know. So how do we go to the point of, you know, making changes in how we speak, how we think, and why is it so difficult even after there has been so much awareness about the mental health landscape in Singapore? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think he directed the question to all 3 panelists. So I'll start with Dr. Jacqueline, and then we'll go down the line. Oh, you want to start first? Okay.
Okay, so as I understand it, you're really asking the question of shared accountability, right? How would I say it? How would you put it?
Is it like, from what I understand, but please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that shared accountability because everyone kind of has a part to play to build that culture of having like mental health resilience. So how do you do that in terms of the language that you use and how you sort of like contextualize that for each person that you meet?
Right, and I think to a large extent, I go back to, I guess, the very basic of what we call counseling skills, right, is empathy. And empathy is really about standing in someone else's shoes. And I think that's really the first step. It's not about what you say or what you do, it's how you interact with the situation, if you put it that way. I think a lot of us, you know, again, if someone breaks up, for example, with their significant other, and you say, oh, that person was never meant for you, you're saying it as an outsider, right? Not someone in their shoes and understanding their experience. And I think the first step then in trying to better understand someone else's perspective is truly standing in their shoes, right? Imagining what it would be like if you were them and having to make those decisions under the limitations or the parameters that they are having to deal with. And I think that's the first step. Because once you can do that, what comes out of your mouth and whatnot is going to be from the point of view of authenticity and empathy. It's not about just saying things for the sake of saying things. It's really about trying to understand their perspective by being, looking at things from their point of view.
Yeah, I just want to write on again on her point. That, when you said to be able to put yourself in their shoes, right? And I'm just reminded of a quote from To Kill a Mockingbird, right? Not only do you step in their shoes, but perhaps to walk a mile in their shoe, right? And to then actually experience what it was like to go through their lenses and their experiences. So to that, I think I just want to comment on this idea that sometimes when we say the accountability is on all, right, we also want to realize that the outcome depends on who's looking at it, right? So if, let's say, as a friend, your analogy was on a breakup, right? So maybe your perspective as a friend is you want your friend to get somebody better. Maybe your friend's outcome of an idea of an ideal outcome is to get back together with that person. So then suddenly your advice suddenly becomes very wrongly placed, because to get over that person is not the outcome that they want, right? So I think from this analogy, we can see that sometimes so-called giving the right advice really depends on what the outcome is. And if that doesn't work, sometimes I also tell clients, parents, or patients that sometimes in an argument or kind of like a negotiation between two parties, do you want to be right, or do you want things to work out? And sometimes they may not be mutually exclusive, and sometimes they may be. Right? So I think that's something to think about in terms of what can we do as individuals.
I think, can I just weigh in very quickly?
Sure.
So I love the contributions from you both, because now I want to think systemically, right? Like at a policy level, right? And I think one thing that, like in our interviews on suicide prevention, I think one of them was with this foreign domestic worker, and she was talking about her own experiences of suicide after a breakup, and I think one of the things that came up is that there is a certain cultural logic of wellness and value, right? Because imagine you are away from your family, you're living in a context where you have very little social connection, whether your relationship with your employers, can you imagine living with your boss like every day? Whether it's good or not, it's not up to your control. But like, where do you find intimacy? Where do you find love? Where do you find support? Sometimes it might be in the form of someone that you see perhaps one day a week, for a certain amount of time. And when that kind of support is gone, you can imagine that actually someone's world can crumble from that, right? Because you've just been, this is where you place so much of your value on. And I think there's something to be said about understanding these cultural logics for different groups. One thing that I also need to say here in the last 5 minutes is I think we often think about this concept of resilience, right? And I think it is useful in terms of maybe thinking about how we as individuals have certain skills and find ways to navigate different challenges and bounce back from things. But there are limits to it, because one thing that we should not assume is that everyone starts from the same level, right? And there are many different communities that face different, like, higher risks. There are many different communities that might have less access to certain skills or certain resources. And I think this idea of community care and being able to do that is something that should be invested in, rather than just focusing solely on what an individual can do and assuming that they have uniform access to everything.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rayner. I've gotten a note from the organizing team that we actually only have 5 minutes left for this Q&A. So I'll try to take a few questions before I get the panelists to answer. It's probably the last round of questions. But if you don't get to ask your question today, I think this conversation is something that doesn't end here. It's something that continues. It's something that we have to continue talking about. So don't feel dejected. But yeah, we're going to take about, I think, the last 4 questions from all 4 of you who are here, and we'll see how best to group them. Could you introduce yourself, and then whether you're representing any organization?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is PJ, currently studying in a polytechnic. I would like to first thank the panelists for the insightful sharings. I especially enjoyed Ms. Jacqueline's sharing, highlighting the challenges that quote-unquote high achievers face. So I'd like to direct my questions to her. As someone who is friends with some high achievers, how can we best support them in the challenges specific to them? Additionally, is there any self-care tips that would be especially helpful to them?
Okay, thank you. To the lady in black, please.
Hi, my name is Trisha, and I'm from
okay.
Cedar Girls.
Sorry.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, never mind. Continue. We will take the final 3 questions. Never mind. Just
Okay.
Share your question, please.
Okay, I'm from Cedar Girls Secondary School, and I would like to thank you all for your speeches. But my question goes particularly to Dr. Jacqueline, because as a student, I think we really could resonate with some of the stuff you said, and really felt like what we were feeling were expressed in words. So my question is, if our school systems, those that for example, cultivate very high-achieving school environments, or these elite schools, implicitly teach students that success is not a choice, but a necessity or requirement, for example, in the expectations they have on us holistically or academically. How can we trust these very systems and school systems to seek out help when we need it? Because it kind of feels as though they're for the other side, or whatever we're going to be saying, it won't be validated back, and we are basically failures for asking for help. For example, asking the school counselors or teachers that we're supposedly trusting. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Would you like to introduce yourself? Sorry, the lady in black at the front, and if you're representing any organization.
I'm Katie. I'm a Polytechnic student. I'd like to ask about something on a higher level, more relating back to the part about how people with more power need to take more accountability for youth mental health. And so as researchers, I'd like to ask if, since there's a lot of your research and interviews that yield personal lived experiences that are very significant to individuals, how can we better utilize these lived experiences or push them more towards the people making policy considerations beyond things like what we're already doing, like public engagements? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, to the gentleman in green.
Yes, hello. My name is Kingston. So I'm currently a J1 student in Temasek Junior College. So thank you for your sharing. I have 2 questions. So firstly, for all the panelists, so may I ask on your views on the current measures in place for schools in both secondary and tertiary education? So having experienced different schools through my personal journey and also internships, I believe that the Ministry of Education does actually provide a lot of support for the students with varying needs. But as Professor Tan has said, this should not be a one-size-fits-all model. So I would like to ask how different teachers, especially with shortening teaching staff relative to the number of students, how does the teaching staff actually help each student in their varying needs? So let's say a student has shown academic performance, but he's feeling very pressurized, and another student is feeling has low academic performance, but he might not feel the pressure now, but may feel the pressure in the future. And secondly, my second question is directed to Professor Jacqueline. So as a student from the integrated program of Temasek Junior College, your sharing actually has deeply resonated with me. So considering that the system comes with both benefits and drawbacks of, not really this system, of the system of academic pressure has come with benefits and drawbacks. So are there any alternative or equally effective approaches that can preserve these benefits? Or alternatively, are there any adaptive measures that can provide students with a stronger safety net so that they do not struggle or fall too deep under pressure? So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have time to address all these questions that have been asked. So I will try to restate some of the questions that have been raised. One is really about the high achieving students in terms of, as a peer, how do you support the students in terms of care? As a teacher as well, then how do you sort of support the students, because there is a sharing about how if that definition of success as being something that is necessary is coming from the school, you don't trust the school or the counselors enough to actually open up to seek help. And then a related question about how, teachers, you have that class size and many students under you, how do you then help people with many varied needs? So it's a lot to do in terms of, I guess, the holistic support you can get in terms of schools. Whether you're a peer or whether you're a teacher, how do you actually help these people who have helped these higher achievers? I think we could take that question first. The second question I will raise again later, which is about power and accountability, about how researchers could better utilize lived experiences other than just through engagements to influence policy. So maybe I'll hand the time over to Dr. Jacqueline first. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to try not to take up too much time. All right, so I think first of all, when you ask how you can help your peers or how you can help friends who may be struggling because of these achievement pressures, I would say ask them how they need to be supported in some ways, right? Because again, if you go back to this idea of individualization, everybody has different needs. Some of them may be struggling with certain things and less struggling with other things, right? And so I think asking them how you can be a support and listening to what they need is actually probably one of the first things I would say. In terms of more of a general tip on self-care, I always say sleep. Singaporean students do not sleep enough. Well, adults don't sleep enough either, right? But I think that this is a horrible epidemic, which I think is crucial, right? Both for your cognitive ability, to learn, but also in terms of mental wellness. And so, I'm just horrified by the fact that most kids don't get enough sleep. They should be getting 9 to 11 hours until the age of about 12 years old. And I'm going to guess most of the kids don't get that, and neither do many adults who need at least 8 hours. So if I could implore any kind of changes from this room about mental wellness today, is try to get more sleep and try to let your kid sleep more, even if it means they don't do their homework. And write the note to the teacher saying, please don't make my kid do their homework. They needed to sleep, otherwise they'll fall asleep in your class tomorrow and they won't know how to do the homework, okay? So this is both in terms of my academic research as well as a parent. All right, so in terms of how we can individualize, okay, second, about the teachers. I think that is one of the challenges, right? And that's exactly the dilemma that Sunil Luther, who came up with this high-achieving youth or high-achieving schools issue, really talked about it, is the problem with the achievement pressures coming from, what we call the youth's microsystem. So that's the schools, the parents, the peers, is that people who are typically supposed to be supportive of the kids are actually those who are creating the risks, right? And so in many ways, you can also think about it in a different way. Why are we then placing all of the changes that need to be done on the schools necessarily? Is there a way for us to think of it more holistically? So maybe you don't trust your teachers to help you, but could you potentially trust another adult in your life, or a peer, a friend, or someone like that? And if you can't, then I think that's a bigger systemic issue that we're looking at. So I think that's one of the things. But also on the other hand, I do think that based on my interactions with most teachers and school counselors, even if they may not seem on the outset to be supportive, they all really mean well, right? They wouldn't be doing their jobs if they didn't. And so I think to some extent is really, in some ways, yes, one perspective that they are pushing your boundaries, but on the other hand, they also come from a place of care, and I say that to parents as well. Parents who overparent or helicopter parent, they come from a place of care, right? And I think the more we talk about the fact that there's two sides of this, they come from good intentions, and yes, the good intentions aren't practiced in the right way, but also for us to begin to see those good intentions all around, right? And so I think, again, it's a societal issue. Then the final part about individualization, right? How do teachers individualize? I go back to the issue of it's not just teachers that should be doing this. I think it should be everybody should be individualizing the necessary care for all people. And that really goes back to treating people as individuals. And that's hard when we're talking about things like systems and policies and all of that sometimes. But I think ultimately that's what we're all saying, I think, in today's panel, that lived experience matters, and therefore an individual's experiences matter. And so if we want to make a difference, it really sometimes is about that one-to-one difference, right, that we make in people's lives. And then for people to continue making that one-to-one difference in many people's lives, and that's how we change, in small ways, society.
There's been quite a bit of talk about power and accountability, and I'm sorry for bringing it up. So I will speak to it, because the idea is that the first part, I think somebody over there talked about how because of the high stakes and high pressure, it makes achievement a necessity instead of a choice. And I think in that kind of circumstance, it really, really feels that there are people on the other side, right? It almost feels like a binary, like the students and then the other side, the systems. And I can see why you would feel that way. What I do want to kind of expand on the idea is that sometimes when we look at the actual system itself, we realize it's comprised of individuals. And some of my friends around my age are teachers now, and sometimes when I speak to them after work, and they're like, oh my goodness, the system. So everybody sees like themselves as the other part, not the system. And then what is the system then? Right? But the reality is that the system is made up of individuals. And I think when we start to see things as an us versus them approach, and you shouldn't be blamed for it, but when we start to do things like that, it makes it very hard to create system change when we set ourselves outside of the system. So perhaps let's start thinking about, if we are all part of the system, what can we do, right? And now to the part about power, the interesting thing is all of us have power, depending on where we are, what context we are, and who we are. So what this means is that you can do something on your own as an individual to what you're capable of. So as a student, right, you're gonna have a lot of sway over your classmate, sometimes even more than a teacher. As a teacher, you're gonna have a lot of sway in terms of maybe homework, right? As a researcher, you have a lot of sway in terms of who to include as your maybe research participants. Right, so if you think about that, we can all use our power in a certain way to make that small change. And because of that, right, including lived experiences, right, if we will listen to lived experiences, researchers include lived experiences. Larger institutions will host platforms like this that includes people with lived experiences. You know, and because of that, by doing that, that's where change starts to happen, and it takes time. Yeah.
And I will leave, like, very quick one. I think I'll build on that and leave you two questions. I think the question that builds on that is, do we have systems then recognize the power that each of us have? Are there ways that discern and identify assets? You know, I think this is something that systems can do, and you know, like provide solutions that leverage these diverse forms of power. You know, I think we don't talk enough about how we do it as well. You know, like when we do these things. So that's one question. The second question then would be, is it really audacious, and it's linked to the first one, is it really audacious to think that we need to rely on teachers and counselors to support youth mental health when youth themselves also possess a lot of different types of power? And you know, I think the question then is, how do we then make that safe, structured, and in a way that benefits everyone?
Thank you so much, Dr. Rayner, Mr. Daniel, and Dr. Jacqueline. I think you've shared really deep insights, and those two questions are questions that I want to think about and take away after this session. We actually come to the end of this panel discussion and Q&A. We've overrun a bit. I truly apologize for that, but I will now hand the time over to the MC.
Thank you. We've come to the end of today's seminar. We would like to hear your views on the event. Please click on the link on the Facebook feed or scan the QR code on the screen to submit your feedback. Our next IPS Nathan lecture will be by Dr. Sean Lam, 18th SR Nathan Fellow, and will take place on 9th March 2026. Details will be on our website and IPS Facebook page. We hope to see you then. Thank you all for attending today's seminar. Have a good evening ahead.